22-year-old's out.
Yes.
Yeah.
She still lives with us, but she's actually a student. She's a nursing student at SUNY at ECC. Yeah.
Very good.
So it's just
When
crazy.
they launch, it's wonderful.
It's nice, isn't it?
Hello. Hello. All right. Thank you, everyone. At least it's not 5 below zero today, so, but we always appreciate your presence. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing the guest lecturer who will be presenting the first half of our session. This is Dr. Paul Rushton, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. He has over 30 years of experience in plant biotechnology, and he's an expert on plant disease resistance, drought responses, vertical farming, and plant secondary metabolites, including cannabinoids and nicotine. So as you know, cannabis is a plant, and so we need a plant biotechnologist to talk to us. He's a leader and lecturer in the field of industrial hemp and cannabis. He also has extensive expertise in soybean, turfgrass, tobacco, cereals, and so on. Dr. Rushton earned a degree in biochemistry from Cambridge University in the UK and a PhD from Manchester University, also in the UK. And he moved to the US
2005.
Yeah,
years ago.
so a couple of decades ago. He spent 10 years researching plant disease resistance at the world-famous Max Planck Institute in Cologne, Germany. And in the UK, he worked at Bristol University and Oxford University. In the US, he's held academic positions at the University of Virginia, South Dakota State University, and Texas A&M. More recently, in Buffalo, he was vice president for plant biotechnology at 22nd Century Group. He holds numerous patents and patent applications. And even though he's been here 2 decades, he still has all those British expressions that I like to hear. So anyway, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Rushton.
Thank you very much. Right, is the mic on? Did you turn it off, or can you hear me first of all? Is that okay?
No? Look here.
Let me just.
Is it?
It is on, I think.
It is on.
I think it's over here. I can probably turn this up a little bit.
Sure.
Right. So can you all hear me? Is that okay? Yeah. I probably don't need the mic anyway, but yeah, it'll help. So okay, it's really nice to be here. I always enjoy coming and giving my annual lecture. I know that you guys are all essentially pharmacy type people, so you're very much interested in the chemistry and what we can do with the potential medical side of hemp and cannabis. But I'm going to show you that it's a much, much bigger world than that, and that all of this starts with a plant. It starts with this one, Cannabis sativa, and one of my main objectives this afternoon is to convince you that this is the most amazing plant on the planet, by far. It's not even close, okay? Because this one plant is the source for not just one type of industry, but at least 3 major types of industry. And depending on who you actually talk to and look at individual things that it can be used for, the uses of this plant are over 10,000, probably over 25,000, and I've seen as high as 50,000. So it can be used for a huge number of different things, one area of which is the medicinal one, but it's not the only one by far. So this is a really, really interesting plant to work with, but it's also a minefield. So every year when I come in and talk to the professor here, we have new stories about the good stuff and the bad stuff. So it's like 1 step forward, 2 steps back. This year, we've had a step forward potentially with the rescheduling, although it hasn't happened yet, but we've had a step back with the bizarre sort of farm bill thing about hemp. So it's difficult to work on this, but the the reason that I work on this is because it is so exciting in so many different ways. So, this is a cannabis sativa leaf, and the first thing I want to emphasize is cannabis sativa L is a single species. You might, and we'll talk about this and I'll show some of it later, see various people that tell you that the recreational varieties are very different from the medicinal, that are very different from the hemp varieties, and they can be, but it's still the same species. You can take something that has very low THC, a very, very tall, thin plant, and it's grown for fiber, and cross it with a little squat one that's grown at the local dispensary for recreational, and it's the same species, and you'll get offspring. Okay? So this is the main thing. So one species, and this means that industrial hemp, medical marijuana, and recreational are all the three main types of industries that come from this one plant. Okay? So that's the good thing. The bad thing comes in here with the way in which cannabis as a plant has been treated over the years, and this is a quote from the Controlled Substance Act from, I think, the early 70s, like 70, 71, something like that. And it says, the term marijuana, which is spelt incorrectly, means all parts of the cannabis sativa plant, whether growing or not, the seed thereof, the resin extracted from any such plant, and every compound, manufacture, salt derivative mixture or preparation of such plant, its seeds or resin. So here, every compound. So what that effectively did is it completely made using cannabis to make new medicines illegal. So this is the problem. And the funny thing about it is they were thinking about doing this before the Second World War. It was in process, essentially. And then the Second World War came along, and they realized they needed hemp. We'll talk about it in more detail, but the reason they needed it is it makes the best cordage for the Navy, because the fibers from hemp are the strongest around. So they had to reverse it, and there's even adverts that they play, and sort of little films that they showed in the cinema, about trying to make people grow hemp. So in the war they did that, and then almost immediately afterwards they went and outlawed it. So the whole thing makes no sense, and you'll get an abiding feeling as we go through that a lot of this doesn't make sense, but you should get a good feeling for the possibilities. Now, here are the three main areas that we're talking about in terms of what cannabis can be used for. So there's the first one here, industrial hemp. It was made federally legal, officially, in certain ways. They have to get a license and stuff, in 2018, in the 2018 Farm Bill. And there's two major areas that hemp is used for. One is fiber, as I mentioned, so that also includes things like textiles, paper, and lots of other things. And the other one is food and supplements. And we'll talk about that. So if you go to Wegmans, you'll find supplements that have hemp in it. You'll find hemp seed oil. You'll find a lot of other things that are based on using hemp as the source of a food. So all of this is basic industrial hemp. It's nothing to do with the chemicals and stuff. Then we get the medical marijuana part. So that's the second of the three tranches, okay? So medical marijuana is using the cannabis plant as the source of medicines. Now, I haven't got the slide actually this year. I just remembered I put an extra slide in, but I haven't got it this year. But it was something we talked about last year. When we're talking about cannabis, everybody always thinks of cannabinoids, and they are amazing, and we'll talk about those. But there are also other compounds which are important. The ones that are really important, I think, are actually the terpenes. Terpenes like myrcene have also been shown to have specific effects. Myrcene tends to make you drowsy, and for certain applications that's quite useful. The terpenes are also what gives the smell and the taste to a cannabis plant, okay? Cannabinoids are fat-soluble, they have no smell or taste. Terpenes are water-soluble, that's what you have the smell and the taste for. So if you go to a CBD store, for example, and they have various different things for you, and it's called something like blueberry or whatever, it's because the mix of terpenes in that particular plant that contains the high CBD for you has certain characteristics that make it smell and taste like blueberries. So that's actually really very, very interesting. Now, the thing about the medical marijuana is it sort of spans two major areas, okay? Because the whole of the cannabis sativa world is split into two halves. The hemp half, which is below 0.3% THC, and everything else, which counts as recreational, which is federally illegal, which is above 0.3% THC. Okay? This 0.3% THC is very important, but it's an artificial chemical line drawn in the sand. Okay? It's trying to make sure that this industrial hemp stuff isn't possible to use for recreational purposes. And in other parts of the world, this might be 0.3%. You could probably do 1%. You wouldn't be able, if you smoked to 1%, you'd have to smoke a huge amount to even have the slightest high. So it's well below the threshold. Now, the problem, of course, is that this creates quite a number of problems. The 0.3% isn't always checked in the same way. So what does 0.3% actually mean? Well, in some places, it means that the highest you can have is 0.299. In other places, it means, for example, you can get, let me put it another way. In other places, they only look at the first decimal point, and they don't care about anything else. So 0.3 is all they want to see, and it has to be above 0.3. So 0.39999 still counts as below 0.3. So there's a huge variation on what this actually means. But in practice, what it means is there are varieties of industrial hemp which characteristically tend to get quite close to this limit and can test hot under certain conditions. If they do, they count as recreational and they're federally illegal. There are also plants that look identical in this area, one of which might have high levels, for example, of CBD or CBG, and it counts as hemp, and another plant that looks identical but has slightly higher levels of THC, and that would actually be recreational and is federally illegal. So there's your problem in the medical marijuana world. You're trying to use maybe the ones that count as hemp, but in reality, THC has positive effects as well, and a lot of the perceived wisdom says that the best mix of different cannabinoids for medicine does include levels of THC which might be higher than 0.3%. Okay? But, and there is one big but on this, a lot of this is conjectural, because as most of this is illegal, we don't have really the clinical trial results that we need to be able to base this on. A lot of it is anecdotal. And I'll show you a bit later why all of those anecdotal things actually mean that we're in the right area. Okay, so if we look at this, the current value, and this is actually from a couple of years ago, all three of these areas that I've shown you, the industrial hemp, the medical marijuana, and the recreational, are billion-dollar industries, okay? And this is the estimate from about 2020, I think, of where that's going to go. And it shows that we're talking about over $100 billion for the total industry. Now, this is probably wildly inaccurate because politics come into it so much. Now, this was almost certainly done when the CBD boom was happening, and we'll talk about the boom and bust thing with CBD. So this is probably going to be low. If the rescheduling happens and we get research, this might be higher. And what I can also tell you is, based on what I've seen just in the Buffalo area, the recreational cannabis world seems to be doing relatively well in terms of just the number of dispensaries that are opening. So this might be lower. But nevertheless, three major areas of billion-dollar industry. It's not bad for one plant species, really. Okay. So, just to give you some idea of what that means. So this is what they were talking about a few years ago. You can see that the estimate for another 5 years would put it probably above where tobacco is at the moment, which sort of explains why a lot of the tobacco companies are sort of sneakily sitting at the back of cannabis conferences, because it's an area that when they can, they will move into, I'm sure. It's more than the soybean industry, more than wine. And the only thing that dwarfs it is the amount spent on medicines. And so there's your big drug companies and everything else. However, if part of this is also new medicines, this could be a very big thing. Okay. If there are any questions, just stick your hands up, by the way. I prefer to take them as we go along while we're still talking about it. Okay, so this slide is an interesting one because it's about the scheduling of various different drugs. And you guys will see a lot of PowerPoint slides during your education. Very few of them will be as wildly inaccurate as this slide. Okay? It's complete and utter rubbish. And it just shows that the combined effect of lots of politicians over half a century just makes something that makes no sense whatsoever. So here we are, okay? Schedule 1. I'll take you through a couple of the things that are just crazy. Heroin, LSD, ecstasy, and marijuana, okay? So it says no legal medical use, high potential for whatever, okay? So it's basically saying it has no possible medical use. And we know that that's complete rubbish. Conversely, if you look at the other end, it shows that all of this is upside down. There's alcohol, which kills just under 100,000 people in the country every year. Here's tobacco. Tobacco kills 500,000 Americans a year. It also contains nicotine. Okay? Nicotine isn't what kills you. It's some of the other compounds in the tobacco smoke. Nicotine is one of the most addictive compounds known to man. It's what makes you come back to smoke because it gives you an endorphin rush, it gives you a bit of a high, and once you get addicted, you are in trouble. Okay? So, let me show you why. These are the top 3 addictive compounds known to man. The most addictive is apparently heroin. Nicotine is put here 3rd, but it's the same dependence rating as crack cocaine. So if you're smoking a cigarette, you're being addicted as high as crack cocaine, and I've actually heard evidence that nicotine is more addictive than that and close to heroin. Okay? So, yes?
How do you get those numbers for the dependence rate?
I got it from this here. I did some research on it a couple of years ago. I'm not a pharmacist. Okay. And I do know that I don't always believe clinical trials because I've done some myself, but it does give you a relatively accurate idea.
So is that like how many times people try to quit it and fail, or like?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the expert, but it's some kind of measure of how hard it is to quit. Okay, so when I came here to Buffalo, I'll mention it in a moment, there were 2 things that drew me here. One was the hemp and cannabis research, and the other was tobacco research. And what they were doing is they were making cigarettes with very low levels of nicotine, below the addiction threshold, so that what you could do is smoke your addiction away if you smoke those cigarettes. And they managed to get FDA approval, and the company is probably about to go bust because what they didn't realize, even though they were a bunch of salesmen, most of them, is you cannot advertise a combustible cigarette. So by bringing it to the market, they brought a really good product that almost certainly works and would save lives that they can't sell. What they should have done is they should have gone down the prescription route so that all the doctors prescribed it, and that would have been better, but they were not clever enough to work that out. Okay. So anyway, this is just craziness. So nicotine, addictive as cocaine and close to heroin, about 500,000 deaths a year. And, you know, alcohol does cause some as well. So if we go back a slide, you can see this is all upside down. Marijuana should be somewhere down here. Tobacco, I would argue, should be somewhere up here because it causes more deaths and is more difficult. Okay. Now, we'll talk a bit later about the proposal to reschedule marijuana to 3, and that would help because Schedule 1, you can't do anything. Okay, there's nothing you can do. You certainly can't, because it's not supposed to have any medical use, you can't do clinical trials and all that sort of stuff. So it's just ridiculous. But something like Schedule 3 would help, and we'll get to a picture a bit later, which is taken in the Oval Office a couple of months ago, and you'll see that all the people in the background are wearing lab coats. So the whole idea is they're trying to project this idea that it's going to be the next new medicine. Okay, so let's get back to the plant itself just for a little bit, okay? So this is interesting. I see this a lot, and I see this mentioned at conferences a lot, particularly by people who are big proponents of hemp. Okay? They say you can tell the difference between a recreational and a hemp variety by the shape of the leaf and by the way that the plant is formed and various other things. And this is absolute codswallop. Completely and utterly 100% false. Okay? And it's because, if you remember, it doesn't matter about the way a plant looks. It's all about that 0.3%. Okay? So you can have a hemp variety, something that's grown for fiber, and if the wrong conditions happens and it comes in at 0.31% THC, it counts as recreational. And then we have varieties, for example, in my lab, which are CBD varieties. They are grown for cannabinoids, just exactly the same as the recreational ones are, and they look the same. But that counts as hemp. And the bizarre thing about the way the world here is structured at the moment, you need a different license to grow one from the other. And really stupid we were talking about this just before we started, I have a hemp grower's license in the lab, and I also have personally the first research cannabis grower's license that the state issued. The cannabis has a lot less reporting than the federal hemp one. So it doesn't make any great sense, really. But anyway, the whole idea is there are different forms and different types of cannabis for different purposes, but you cannot tell by eye which one is which. You need to actually measure the THC. So anyone that tells you anything differently, like this slide, that's rubbish. So there we are. That's that line in the sand there. And although these may look a bit different from those, they don't necessarily have to. Okay. So we're now going to talk a little bit about hemp, and actually, while we go through this, I'm going to mention 4 different presidents of the United States at different times for different reasons. Okay? So we're going to sort of start doing this. So this is generally, with the proviso of the slide I just showed you, this is generally what a hemp variety looks for that's grown for fiber. So they're actually long and tall and thin, and the fibers are inside the stem, so inside the sort of bark part. They're part of the sort of vascular tissue and everything else. So this is the sort of thing that is grown for fiber. And there are some huge opportunities in this area. So just a couple of quotes, So this one here, a guy called Jeff Gain, who was the head of the National Soybean Growers Association, said industrial hemp is the next soybean. Well, it hasn't been yet, but it has more potential than soybean. Soybean only has a few uses, and they may be very important, but this can do a whole lot more. Okay? So it's possible that hemp could be the next big agricultural commodity if you grow it for food, if you grow it for fiber, all of these things. And this is completely devoid or removed from all of the chemistry stuff, all of the medical stuff, all of the recreational stuff. This is just agriculture, okay? So this is why, as I said at the beginning, I'm going to convince you that this is the most interesting plant on the planet by far. Right, so I promised you some presidents, and here are a couple of them. So Washington and Jefferson, so some of the founding fathers. Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon, and during his presidency, you could pay your taxes with hemp because everybody grew it and everybody needed it. It was the way of making really good fiber. You could make ropes, you could make clothing and everything. So he knew in the New World that it was inherently very valuable. Thomas Jefferson, who is sort of one of my heroes, went a step further. And so my first faculty position, junior faculty position, was at UVA, the University of Virginia. And that was Thomas Jefferson's retirement project, okay? And he used to sit up in his house at Monticello on the hill and had a big telescope and used to watch them building the university down in the valley. But he actually invented a hemp threshing machine. And you saw the tractor in the previous one. Having the right type of equipment is really important because these things are bloody big. And so he had one of the first patents to do with this threshing machine. And it's his quote that is generally used by the hemp people the most, which is, hemp is of first necessity to the wealth and protection of the country. So wealth, very important. protection, he's talking about the ships and the Navy probably. That's where it's used most. So all the way back to the late 1700s, hemp was really important. Now, I mentioned that there are up to, say, 50,000 uses for hemp, which is just colossal. But I'm going to take you through some of the ideas now, some of the stuff that doesn't include medicinal, doesn't include recreational. We're going to talk about all of the other things that hemp can do. So let's start here, food, okay? You can make cold-pressed oil from the seed of the hemp plant, and it's pretty similar to olive oil. It has a really good amount of omega-3s and omega-6s, so it's a very healthy oil. So just that alone is important. You can make margarine from that. If you go to Wegmans, you'll see lots of food supplements and sort of various things that contain hemp. So it's a food as well as a fiber, okay? Now, these oils can be used for various other industrial products, like oils and varnishes and so forth. So you can see how the number of possible uses for cannabis sativa starts to tick up considerably. So all of these things like putties and coatings, it can also be used, like a lot of other oils, to make things like soaps. So you can have soaps and shampoos and things based on hemp. There's food, so granola and so forth. One of the most potentially useful things for hemp is to actually use the byproducts as animal feed. But that's a problem because that was illegal. I'm not even sure whether it is yet. But the biologicals company that I helped form about 5 years ago, they're a commodity trading company as well, and they were very interested potentially in using hemp and selling it as animal feed, but they weren't able to do it. Okay, then you have the more fiber types of things over here. So here's the bast fibers, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So you can make clothes. You can make diapers that don't contain cotton. You can make it to make jeans. You can also then use it to make, obviously, ropes and paper and all of these things. So a decent number of important historical documents are actually written or printed out on hemp paper. So you can see that all the different parts, the leaves, the flowers, the seeds, the stalks, pretty much everything, the roots not so much, can be used. But there are some huge areas here. There are plants, people, areas of industry here that if you were just using one of them would be very important. But if you look at the numbers here, it's crazy. Soybean can't do this, wheat can't do this, but cannabis can. Okay, so when we look at the fibers, this is what we're talking about. So just inside the original bark part, here are the bast fibers, and they run all the way up the plant, and they can be at least 3 foot long, up to 15 feet long. And they have incredible tensile strength. So this is why they were used to make cordage for the Navy. It's also why they're used in other things like automobiles, and we'll talk about that in a moment. You could add it in, and it will add incredible strength to something. So that on its own, if that plant just had incredible fiber material, it would be an important plant. But it does so much more. Okay, so here's the third president, and this is George H.W. Bush, who owes his life to hemp. Okay, so it's a bit unfortunate here. So in September 1944, he was in his torpedo bomber, and they were hit, and it caught fire, and he managed to make it almost back to the ship and had to bail out. And he bailed out over the water, and he survived. Okay, unfortunately, the other two crew members didn't. But what he didn't really know is this is, the type of plane that he was flying. The engine was lubricated by hemp seed oil, and even more importantly, all of the parachute webbing was made with hemp fibers. So George W. Bush owes his life to a hemp-made parachute. Okay? This is not something that soybean can do, and we're not talking about new medicines here. We're talking about something completely different, but this is why this plant is so interesting. Okay, so that's fiber. Let's talk about food. So Look at this, from the seeds, oil. You can make a flour from it. You can actually make hemp beer. I've tried it, it's disgusting. Don't ever try it. It tastes horrible. But theoretically you can do it because it's a source of carbohydrates. You can basically use that. It's probably better than using potatoes for vodka or whatever, but it doesn't taste very nice. You can use it for other things like making a type of butter or margarine. You can use it for paints. Even the bits that would normally be thrown away, like the leaves and the flowers, it can be used for animal bedding and mulch and so forth. And the stalks can also be used. I've talked to various people over the years who actually would like to use those parts for things like animal bedding because it's actually something that otherwise would be thrown away and they're quite cheap. And if you look at this one here, this is the highest one I've seen, they claim over 50,000 uses, which is incredible. Now, there is one proviso about all this high number of different potential uses for hemp and different industries and so forth. Most of those, if there are really 50,000 uses, 49,900 and something are probably fringe. They're probably a mum and pop shop might be able to make some kind of money out of it, but it's not going to power hemp, cannabis as an industry. You need a few major uses. I certainly think one of the major ones, if not the major one, is going to be using cannabis as a source for new medicines. We'll talk about that in a moment. But anyway, this is just amazing. And just to show this, so I came to Buffalo in the end of October 2015. And my wife and the kids stayed in Dallas, where we were before, until the end of the school year. But I went and visited often, and the first time I went back after about 2 or 3 weeks, and my good lady wife had put this hemp milk in the fridge, which I'd never seen before. She'd gone down to the local supermarket and bought it, and there it is, you see. An excellent source of omega-3 and 6, vitamin B12, vitamin D, soy-free, which is nice, and gluten-free. So it just shows you that was around about the beginning of a lot of the things that were going on with hemp. But as hemp became legal in the 2018 Farm Bill, we saw a whole lot more things. So next time you're in Wegmans and you're wandering around, you've got a bit of time, go and have a little look and see how many things you can find, because there'll be a few. Now, I wanted to mention one other thing, particularly because Lorraine liked this last year and I thought it was important. Now, I've been teaching last semester the sustainability course at Damon. And one of the things we talked about was this problem here, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, okay? It looks like something like this, and because of the ocean currents, there are 2 major areas, a western and an eastern one. And the problem is all of this plastic gets in there. And what happens to it eventually degrades, but it doesn't really degrade, it just becomes microscopic particles of plastic, which sit around forever, more or less. So you have this problem. Okay, so the question is, what can we do about it? And the answer is, one of those potential answers comes from hemp, because we can use the hemp fibers to make bioplastics which are degradable. That's pretty neat. I've never quite worked out exactly how they've done this. It looks like they've buried the bottle almost. I know this works because we've actually made some bioplastic in the lab. It was a bit more like saran wrap, but you can take the fibers and you can actually make them into a plastic. So, and it says things like this, the latest Porsche model, the 718 Cayman GT4, has hemp fibers in its panels to give rigidity. So all of these uses for bioplastics are incredible. Now, what I don't know is if you use this for milk, why this doesn't biodegrade in your fridge. So I'd have to do a bit more work on this. But theoretically, this could be an answer to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And this is just an extra sort of usage of hemp, just out the blue, really. It just shows you how many different things you could do. Right, are there any questions? Because that's the end of the industrial hemp part. We're going to go now into the bit that's probably more the area that you guys are interested in, because we're going to talk about medical marijuana. Yes?
We use the microphone for the Panopto.
Thank you. Doctor, did you have any insight regarding cannabis ruderalis? I know it was bred to create faster varieties, aka autoflowers.
Yeah, I mean, Ruderalis is another species, essentially. So the problem with that, of course, is, I don't know what the regulations are. Does it come in under cannabis sativa and everything else, or is it different? If you can cross it, you can use it. But then if the progeny has any type of cannabis sativa genetics in it, then it counts as cannabis. So then you haven't actually gained that much. But anything like that could add to the genetic diversity, particularly in terms of molecules, and we'll talk about that in a moment, could be useful. But it's not something that we've actually considered doing because it's just a little bit too much out there. There's enough problems with trying to work out what the hell's going on in the cannabis sativa world, yet alone something else.
Right. Thank you.
Right. Okay. So it's an old one now. It's 10 years old, this paper, but I like this because I like the title. So when you get to see the lecture notes, and see you have a look at what I've actually produced here today, you might want to go back and have a look at this. The idea that cannabis is the plant of 1,001 molecules is really interesting, and it highlights why it's potentially so useful as a source of new medicines. Okay, so we're not just talking about cannabinoids, and the cannabis plant can make about 100 different cannabinoids. But we're also talking about terpenes and other compounds, and then we're talking about mixtures. And I'm going to mention the entourage effect, which you may have heard of, about the effect of more than one compound from cannabis at the same time, a bit later, because it's sort of a no-brainer, really. And people talk about it too much because it's just obvious. But we'll talk about that. So anyway, we're going to talk about the medical marijuana area. Medical marijuana is legal in 40 states, so more than half of the country. And it's been like this for quite some time. So only really the grey areas are a problem. So we're talking about something that has huge potential. Now, every time I sort of go on my computer and try and Google stuff, I always seem to find this. It seems to be used an awful lot. But it's quite interesting. So it sort of sets this medical thing up quite nicely. Here are some of the more well-known cannabinoids. So CBG, CBC, THC, and then CBD itself. And it gives you some idea of the potential of the plant for medicines. Given the fact that we can't do proper clinical trials, essentially, a lot of these things may be based on anecdotes and old wives' tales and everything else. But as we know from things like aspirin, coming originally from salicylic acid from willow bark, a lot of these things are rooted in some fact. So if we look at CBD, I'll just read this. You imagine looking at one compound potentially having these positive effects. It's antibacterial. It's been reported to inhibit cancer cell growth. That's huge. It's a neuroprotective. It promotes bone growth. It reduces seizures. That's clear. There's at least one medicine on the market that is actually there for treating seizures, and it's CBD. It reduces blood sugar levels, reduces function in the immune system, reduces inflammation, risk of artery blockage, reduces vomiting and nausea, reduces pain, relieves anxiety, slows bacterial growth, suppresses muscle spasms, has a tranquilizing effect, can be used to treat psoriasis, and is a vasoreactant. That sounds pretty promising to me. If you're looking at where can I go to make new medicines? Now, I have a question for you all. On this, because CBD has the biggest chunk, it has the biggest number of potential uses. Now, there's still some ones over here. So look, for example, there are some others here. But yes, CBG inhibits cancer cell growth. Do we think, therefore, that CBD is the most useful cannabinoid from cannabis?
Raise your hands. What do you think? I love. There you go. What do you think?
So
Yes.
do you think that CBD is potentially the best starting point for new medicines, given that it has all of these things associated with it compared to the other ones here?
Yeah, probably, because it seems more versatile.
Right. That is actually a good answer because it's wrong, but I will tell you why it's wrong. Okay? I'll answer the question now.
We've got another response here.
Okay, another response.
I would say yes, just because like there's an FDA approved like CBD for seizures, so I guess it's the most prominence is probably not the right word, but the most leading, I guess.
It's interesting.
Promising.
Oh, there's a hand up over there. What do you think? Yeah. Wait for the mic.
I feel like a lot of these uses that are like for CBD can be like other medications doing these, like reducing blood sugar. You can do that with other things. Relieving pain can be done with other things, relieving anxiety. So I feel like although this is like a lot of things, I feel like inhibiting cancer cell growth seems like something that might need more research compared to like finding other ways to reduce blood sugar.
It does need more research. You're absolutely right. There's one more over there.
I'd guess that it's probably just the most studied, and so we've got the most like guesses at things it can be used for.
You're halfway there. It's the most studied, but why is it the most studied?
It's the most studied because it's non-psychoactive, unlike Delta 9.
That's part of it, but the main part of the answer is a very simple one. CBD is the most abundant. That's why. So the point of all this, okay, is we have all of these things from CBD because it's the one that everybody has. So all of these things that have been reported is because everybody has CBD. What about the other 99 cannabinoids that are rarer? They might be better than CBD, but we don't know. So this is where some of the cannabis, in terms of the medical marijuana, biotech comes in. And one of the things I'm interested in is what happens if you take the other 95 that aren't as abundant as CBD, because CBD has all of this promise. What about the other ones? We know, and I'll talk about it in a moment, that they sometimes bind to different receptors. They have slightly different molecular shapes. So this is the reason. We're just scratching the surface because all of this is based on CBD because it's the most abundant. So when there was this big thing after 2018 and the Farm Bill, and all of these CBD stores opened, it wasn't because they necessarily wanted to sell you CBD and because it was going to be a wonderful new drug. It was because that's what they had because it was the most abundant. Okay? I actually think CBG and CBC hold more promise than CBD for a number of reasons, which I won't go into. But that's the thing. And it shows you how we need clinical trials. We need to pursue this to make new medicines. And it illustrates the huge unresolved promise that we talk about every year. Okay, so when I talked about the CBD thing, it's crazy because everybody jumped on the CBD bandwagon. As soon as it was illegal and you could grow hemp, everybody grew it. Now, I had, at the company that I was at the time, one of the first hemp growers licenses in the state. Okay, I think it was number 12. And a year or so later, I actually looked through all the different people who had them, and you had to write down what you had it for, okay? And there were over 100, but 98% were growing for CBD. So they weren't growing to make oil or food or fiber. They were all jumping on the CBD bandwagon. And I actually went to a conference once where someone in the bar was actually saying, I am deliberately driving down the price of CBD. So it started to become about money, and then everything just crashed. So this is the crash. So here's the Farm Bill. Here's the amount licensed and planted, and here is quite a lot, and then it just dissolves. Now, if any of you have been to the intersection of, let's get this right, Main and Transit, there used to be a MedMen on there with the red signs and stuff. One of the more well-known brands of CBD. It's not there anymore. It closed, and it's been taken over by a dispensary. That shows you where this is all heading at the moment, but particularly in our state, the recreational field, people are opening dispensaries all over the place, but there's nothing really happening with the other cannabinoids. So it's a huge, untapped possibility. So there we are. So here, this is the area. We can do this bit, or we certainly could, as long as it's below 0.3. But once you get here, it gets complicated. And there really hasn't been enough work on this. Now, one of the comments that we just had was about the idea of, well, we don't know a great deal about these things and it's all unproven and so forth. And the answer is yes, we don't know a lot about this. We do need to do more. But if we think about the evidence of what we know about the human body, there is absolutely no doubt that this stuff works. It's just a question of how and how much. What can we do with it? Because in everybody's body, there is a system called the endocannabinoid system, which has been criminally understudied even at medical schools. Okay? And its basic idea is that it works at the interface of various other systems in the body, and its main idea is to promote homeostasis. So this is where, for example, you can see why CBD, for example, is very good at things like stopping seizures, and why cannabinoids are used for people who have PTSD and so forth. So they're found in various different organisms and organs, and they minimize the pain and damage, for example, caused by injury. They have a number of other really interesting things that they do. Okay? So we're talking about the nervous system, we're talking about the brain, we're talking about the immune system, and we're talking about the endocannabinoid system sort of binding everything together. This is not something when I was doing biology that I would have learned about. You have a question?
Does this work hand in hand with our internal opioid system, or are they working in completely different ways?
I think it depends on the receptors and stuff. The endocannabinoid system has its own receptors. So it depends where the opioid molecules actually bind. And I'm not an expert on that. I have to put my hand up and say that. What I do know is that cannabinoids bind to specific receptors, and we'll talk about those in just a second. Okay? So, but this is also where we'll talk about the entourage effect as well, where we can understand that. So let's go on and do this. This will start to answer maybe some of your questions. So the endocannabinoid system, there's a couple of really nice slides here, which I didn't make myself, but I show every year because they're so beautiful. And this is one of them, okay? So there are a number of different receptors that act in the endocannabinoid system that are bound by various different endocannabinoids, and also, obviously, the phytocannabinoids. So we'll make a distinction here. The endocannabinoids are the ones that your body has naturally. Phytocannabinoids are the ones that the plant makes that we add in. That can be new medicines. So the two main ones, they're not the only ones, the two main receptors are the CB1 receptor, and that's found mostly in your brain. That's where THC binds. So that's one of the reasons, presumably, why THC is psychotropic. There's also the CB2 receptor, which is found in various different parts of your body. Now, what's interesting is there is a tie-in here between endocannabinoids, phytocannabinoids, and your nervous system. And I'll show you that in just a moment, okay? Because it makes it possible to understand a little bit about what's actually happening and why these things can work, okay? I'm not really going to say much about this. I show this slide every year because it's just so beautiful. It's just so nice, okay? CB1 in the brain, CB2 mostly found within the immune system. Right, so this is what I was leading up to. This is why I'm convinced that cannabinoids will work as medicines, okay? Because we can understand a bit about this, okay? Here's your CB1 receptor, and it's found at synapses, okay? Now, in the normal course of events, your endogenous cannabinoid, something like anandamide, which is a neurotransmitter thing, here, binds to the CB1 receptor. THC has a very similar molecular shape to anandamide and binds to the same receptor. So what it means is the reason why cannabis sativa is so incredible as a potential source of medicine is it makes a decent amount of chemicals which just happen to have the same shape as these molecules in your own body. So it's relatively similar to anandamide. There are other plants that do make a certain amount of cannabinoids, but nothing like the amount that cannabis makes, okay? So this is why this works. This is why we can be certain that they can be the sources of new medicines because that's their target. Okay? THC targets that. We have a molecular mechanism. We just don't know yet how well it will work as a medicine. Okay, so there are other receptors. So this goes back to your question, okay? And I'm not sure in the human body, because I'm not an animal scientist, exactly what normally binds to all of these. But you can see there are various different receptors, and the different cannabinoids will bind to different ones. So this is also important when we're talking about how to make medicines and why some of the old wives' tales that come out of the old people who've been taking medicinal cannabis for years, why they talk about certain things. And I'm going to talk about it now. So here's an idea, okay? So THC binds to this receptor, CBN binds to this one, CBG binds to that one, CBC binds to that one. Okay, you've already got 4 active molecules in potentially one plant. CBD, they're not quite sure exactly where it binds, but it does. It does something. Okay, 5 different ones. Now, I've heard a lot more people arguing about this than I really would want to, because what they talk about, and if you looked on things like LinkedIn or you go to conferences, they will argue about something called the entourage effect, which comes from the people who smoke cannabis, and they will say that there is a whole lot more effect when you have more than one cannabinoid in a complex mixture than if you just take something like CBD alone. And others will argue about it, and it just gets complicated. And the answer is, of course it bloody works better. I mean, the analogy I always use is this. If you imagine, say, THC binding to one receptor is playing one note on a piano keyboard. CBN is another note. So if you have a complex mixture, you're playing a chord, not a single note. This is why the entourage effect is real. And this is why the best medicines based on cannabinoids might well not contain a single cannabinoid, but a mixture of them. Also explains why we need to look at the rare ones. So that's the reason. So what's nice about this is not old wives' tales sitting around a campfire and all this stuff. This is based on actual molecular biology. So we can see where this is going and the effects that it might be having. So isn't it time that we put money and effort into actually making this work for us and having new medicines? That would be my argument. Okay, are there any questions? Because we've got to the end of the medical part. There's any at the
So
end?
the slides will be available.
Yeah.
Usually Dr. Rushton presents and then sends me the slides, and I will post them.
So, would you also agree, or is it essentially that the fact that the cannabinoids are working in tangent with one another to provide the best effects as opposed to one or the other? And that's why, I've been in medical dispensaries and they have products that are equal parts THC and CBD.
Yes. The people who have actually been doing this for many years will swear blind that there are certain combinations that work better. So one of my former colleagues who's in his 70s now actually has been doing this partly in Europe as well. And I think I'm right in saying he was shot in the back at one point in Vietnam as well. So he's had sort of pain issues and things. He always says you need a certain amount of THC beyond the 0.3% to have the best effect. And that's probably because you're tweaking the CB1 receptor. And if you don't have that, you won't. And you need to hit them together. But this is the whole point. It's not a pill with a single thing in it that is probably going to be the best one. But we do have to do that reductionist approach, go and look at each one, do clinical trials probably on each one before we start putting them back together again. Because otherwise it's too complicated and too difficult probably for the regulations for the feds to get it through. So it's going to take a while. But I think in the way that you have some medicines that have more than one active component, I think that's probably where we would be going. And I think all of the evidence from the plants tell us that.
I agree. Thank you.
Okay, so let's look at the third bit now. And we're going to talk about the recreational. Now, it's interesting because I try and update this every year. So I have a map of the world in a moment, which I know Lorraine liked last year, because it was something she was going to talk about herself a bit later. But this is interesting. So if you looked, when I looked at the medicinal, there were 40 states where medicinal marijuana is allowed, and it's still this year, so it hasn't changed. But over the last year or two, the recreational one has. So we're talking about places like Ohio and Minnesota. So the situation now is there are 24 states plus Washington, D.C., where recreational is legal. One more, and it's the majority. You can make an argument that's close to it now. In fact, it should be the majority because a state where I used to live, South Dakota, they voted that they wanted recreational, and then their governor, who's now part of the government here, nixed it, basically. So South Dakota should be on that, but it isn't. But that's the big difference, and I think the biggest change that I've seen two big changes actually in the 10 years I've been here. Firstly, when I used to drive to work, I didn't see a single dispensary of any description. Then suddenly, you couldn't get to work without driving past 4 or 5 CBD stores. And now they've all gone, and you can't go to work without driving past 2 or 3 dispensaries. They just keep opening all over the place, even though 1 or 2 of them are folded. So it's about supply and demand. It's all about money and stuff. And what it's saying to me is there's a market for this, and people are buying it, and people are making lives out of it. You know, this is why people study it to a large extent. So this here is the biggest change that's happened in our state and in a lot of the other states. So we'll see where this goes. But this is also why I said that those estimates of where those $100 billion industries are going to be in 2030 could be wildly inaccurate. Okay, so here we are again. This is what a grow looks like. It could be for THC, it could be for CBD, it could be for CBG, it could be anything. And this just again reiterates anandamide and THC have a similar molecular shape. There's your CBD, which, if it only produces that, counts as hemp. It's federally legal. That's the THC. If it's above 0.3, it isn't. And the latest number I've seen is that there are at least 113 different cannabinoids that the cannabis plant can make. So a lot of the biotech stuff that I think about a lot is aimed at getting those other 100 or so that we haven't really been able to study at all. So we've already talked about that. So here's the interesting slide. So this, you can actually, I don't like to use Wikipedia much because I don't trust it, but this is actually the one thing it does do well. It's like a map of all the data from around the world showing where you can either have recreational or medicinal or whether it's illegal. And this is the map from last year, okay? Now you can see Thailand on here and Georgia. Sometimes these regulations and various different governments do funny things and it goes back and forth. But last year they were legal. If you look over here, there's Minnesota, there's Ohio, but have a look at this, have a look at Europe, okay? So this was last year, this is now. So it's interesting, Thailand has disappeared and so has Georgia. We've got a couple of extra states here, but look at that. That's Germany, the Czech Republic, and Luxembourg, okay? So the big change is the first big countries in Europe have started to make recreational legal. It's already okay there to do medicinal. So maybe the Europeans are going to get a jump on us in terms of being able to develop new medicines, because if that's federally legal in Germany and they can essentially do anything, that's fine. And to make that that point a bit stronger, I always like to bring in some little examples and stories and things. I actually spoke to somebody who is a cannabis research scientist from the Humboldt in Berlin a couple of weeks ago. And they're quite interested in some of the things that we're doing downtown. He said, and it's like a quote, that it's pretty easy to get funding to do the work in Germany at the moment. It's certainly not here. So that in itself shows you that if the US doesn't act quickly enough, all that IP is going somewhere else.
So I want to point out that Canada, it's legal because of the federal law. So the US is a patchwork. Canada has one federal law that allows it. Another country where they've done a lot of cannabis research, mostly for CBD, is Israel.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
the father
it's
of-
happening elsewhere, put it that way.
There is a lot of research in Israel, and it is an interesting situation there. I don't know exactly what it is in terms of, but I know that, I've forgotten his name now, one of the main scientists, he died very recently, who discovered a lot of these things to do with cannabis, was an Israeli. So the Israelis have been on this for a long time, and I think they've used it a lot for things like PTSD for the troops and things like that. So it just shows you some of the countries are much more forward-looking than the others. Okay, so I had to put this in. So this is the fourth president, okay, because this is the big change from where we were last year to where we are now, theoretically, okay? So here he is. And what's interesting is, look at all those lab coats, okay? This is being projected as a medical thing. So if you look back, I liked this because my slide has a lab coat as well. And it's sort of, there it is. So Trump signed this executive order towards the end of last year, and a lot of people are very excited and happy about it, and I will be when it finally actually happens. Now, these things take a while, okay? So basically, that executive order tells the Attorney General to expedite the rescheduling, okay? And it means that it frames this as acknowledging medical value and low abuse potential. So the problem was always this, and I would talk to Lorraine about this, every time. Even if they wanted to do clinical trials based at UB, they couldn't, because it's federally illegal. And if you accepted money to do it, you could actually put the whole university into jeopardy, because it was then doing something federally illegal, and, and the way the universities have been clamped down on recently, you don't want things like that to happen. So it was a real no-no. The only chance you might have is if somebody like me has a license and you can do it through a company, but that's not really what you want to do. And a lot of the stuff also is to do with more fundamental research. And the place for more fundamental research is undoubtedly a university. So you might be doing things like clinical trials to see if something works, but if you don't understand the molecular basis, you're not really doing it properly. Okay, so the whole idea is this, that you can, is to support research, supposedly, if it happens, if you believe it, and limit the federal coverage. So basically, limited federal coverage, things like CBD. So somebody has told the president this is really good for, for medicine and stuff, and that somebody somewhere is going to make some money, and that's probably why he's done it. Now, this is sort of interesting because I found this as well, and it's sort of, I don't want to necessarily criticize the current regime for this, because they've actually done something, because all of this is the timeline up to about here of the previous government. And they had 4 years to do something and nothing happened. It's all a load of waffle here, basically. Nothing happened. So, credit where it's due. We'll see if this happens, because it's happened relatively quickly. And if that scheduling happens, then you remember the sort of piece of fiction that I showed you that showed the scheduling? It moves from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. And that's probably a decent place for it, I think. Because there are some concerns about potential addiction and using it too much. It's like a lot of things. But Schedule 3 would actually be something where I could talk to Lorraine, and we could talk to other people here, and some chemists and some pharmacists, and just say, okay, we can make this in the lab. Let's get some money, some research dollars from the government to do a clinical trial. We'll do a phase 1. If it works, then we'll approach a big drug company, see if they'll come up with the money for the rest. And then, we own some of the IP and everybody makes some money and the patients get better. That would be fantastic. So we'll just have to see. But the problem is the government always seems to move at a snail's pace. And so we'll see whether it gets done. But it's a step in the right direction. Okay, so what would it mean if it's rescheduled to Schedule 3? There would be a recognition of medical use and lower abuse potential, easier federal research access, and the cannabis businesses would no longer be in a difficult situation with the tax laws and everything else. So it would actually facilitate a few things. What it wouldn't mean is that recreational is federally legal. That won't be the case. You still won't be able to buy stuff like that in Texas. And the state laws still remain independent. So unlike Canada, where it's federal, again, it would be a patchwork of what each state does. So, good luck in trying to find, recreational in Utah anytime soon. Okay. So the last couple of things, and I have no idea how long I've talked for, so I may have talked too long or whatever, but, I wanted to give you the benefit of some of my thoughts. I'm going to talk just a little bit about a couple of things that we're doing downtown in the lab at MedGrow, and why this sort of biotech could help us make new medicines and new varieties and so forth. Okay, so if you look at where plant biotech is going at the moment, one of the main areas that people are working on is gene editing, okay? So you go in with something like CRISPR-Cas9 and you make a little change to the genome. You might turn a gene on, you might turn a gene off. For me, the interest is, can we change something in a pathway so we can get more of, for example, a rare cannabinoid compared to a normal cannabinoid? That would be fantastic. However, there is a slight problem. When you put the CRISPR-Cas9 construct in, you make a transgenic plant. It's the same if you're using it for animals. So it counts as GMO. And if any of you ever come to my Dr. Rushton Saves the World special lecture, which I give relatively recently, and I give maybe 2 or 3 times a year, you'll understand that I hate the term genetically modified, GMO, because every single thing you ever eat is genetically modified. The moment you start to selectively breed something, you've modified the genetics. The single biggest, I'm going on a rant now, the single biggest feat of genetic engineering that man has ever done was making corn from a little grass that was like this. And it was done by the Mesoamericans a couple of millennia ago with no idea about genetics. They just bred it. And we now know there's about only 5 genes out of about 30,000 that they changed. 4 at least of those 5 are transcription factors, which are the proteins that turn on other genes. So it all makes sense. Okay, so anyway, GMO is a misnomer. What you should be talking about is transgenic, something that has foreign DNA in. Now, when you do gene editing, you put this construct in so that the first plant you produce is a transgenic. It has foreign DNA. It rewrites the genome, but it doesn't have to stay there, that construct. It's done its job. So you can do a cross with a wild type, and the progeny will have this edited out, but they won't have the transgene anymore. So the progeny is non-GMO. Now at least in the US, because it doesn't have any foreign DNA. So gene-edited plants, for example, that no longer have any foreign DNA do not count as GMO in North America. In Europe, they're just bringing in a new set of laws for the same thing, okay? So you can imagine if we can do the same thing in cannabis, and particularly if we can play with the cannabinoid biosynthetic pathway, that's how we get to the rare cannabinoids, or at least one of the ways we can get to the rare cannabinoids. But there's a problem. You have to go through that transgenic intermediate, which means you have to be able to make transgenic cannabis plants. And that's almost impossible, okay? There are about maybe 3 places or so that I know of in the world who can actually do this. One's in Wisconsin. The other one is downtown, because we can do it, okay? And I'll show you. So these are transgenic plants. And what we've done is we've put a transgene in, so a little bit of foreign DNA, with a strong promoter. So that's a strong on or off switch. In this case, it's an on switch, in front of a gene called GUS. And GUS is useful because if you put it in a staining solution, if that gene is in there, it goes blue. So all you're trying to do is to show that you can make plants that have the foreign DNA in and that go blue. These are blue. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's lots of them. Okay? So we have the technology downtown to be able to make these transgenics, which means as soon as some of these other possibilities are available in terms of research and everything else, we have some of the molecular tools that you need. Now, we've been able to show that we can do this with both the fiber and flower types. We've used multiple different foreign bits of DNA, and the inserted DNA, the foreign DNA, is stably inherited. So that has all the hallmarks of exactly what you want, even if you're trying to cross it out later. Okay? So it means that we're interested in a number of things in the cannabis plant. So increasing yields is always one of those things. Faster growth, disease resistance. So there's something called the hops latent viroid, which is decimating some of the cannabis grows, and is a problem particularly because it's not even a virus. It's a tiny piece of a virus, essentially, like virus-like thing. So that's a problem. Now, one of the things that they've done with similar viroids in tobacco is use an RNAi approach to knock it down. Now, to do that, you're going to have to make a transgenic plant. We can make a transgenic plant. Now, it might be that some of the more traditional cannabis growers do not want a GMO plant, but my feeling is money talks. And if you have something that solves the problem, people will buy it. More cannabinoids, and obviously particularly the rarer cannabinoids, and then terpenes, unique terpenes. So one of the things that you could do, for example, for the more recreational part of this big set of industries, is you can play around with the flavor. There are lots of terpenes that the cannabis plant doesn't make that have specific tastes and flavors. They're often, the terpenes are often actually named after where they're found. So there's limonene, which is like a lemon type of thing. And there's other ones. So you can actually look at the names of the terpenes themselves. It will give you an idea what type of flavor they bring. So if you're in an industry where you have something that is in some way either edible or smokable or whatever it might be, you can play with the flavor. So that gives you immediately something which is useful. And so just finally, I think this is my final slide. It's not just me that thinks that this is going to be useful, because this is an article in Forbes, and it's just about a year old now, just about 2 years old actually, saying that genetic engineering, particularly making transgenics, could revolutionize the cannabis industry and would be the next big thing. So there are certain tools that you need to bring any plant species up to speed in terms of being able to do biotech. And this transformation technology was the one that was really holding back cannabis sativa. And it looks like
Yes, questions. You have the opportunity to ask one of the leading plant biologists, molecular biologists of cannabis, about what he does and potential uses. So
I know that we talk about CBD and a lot about how we can't research it based on the restrictions that we have on it now. So what made you look at it and be like, I'm going to look into this, considering that we have so many blockades on it currently?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons.
can you, we're not hearing you. I don't know what happened. Did your battery run out? I bet it did. You know what? There's another microphone. Yeah.
This one works, that's better. Okay.
Yeah.
So it was one of those interesting things, because, if you're a sort of a biologist, you're always looking for, what is the next exciting thing to work on? And I was interested in cannabis for some time because of all of these different things I've shown you. But that was back in something like 2010. And my wife was always telling me, when I was at the faculty at a couple of universities, you should work on cannabis. And I said, I can't. Not only can you not get funds, which is then the kiss of death, but even if you could, you wouldn't be allowed to do it. But then I was given the opportunity to move to a company where I was an expert in reducing levels of nicotine, but the other thing they were interested in was cannabis. and particularly hemp in that case. So I was given the opportunity of moving into a new area, which I thought was going to be really interesting and somewhere that would be good over the next 10 to 20 years, and also do something that I was an expert in already. So that was really the reason. And the more you get into the cannabis sativa world, two things happen. You get more and more interested in what could be done, and more frustrated by what actually you can do. And it's those two opposing things that you have to deal with.
Any other questions? Okay, I know everybody wants a break. But every time I hear Dr. Rushton, I learn more. It's always fascinating. So thank you once again. We really appreciate your lecture.
Thank you.
Okay, take a break. 4 o'clock, well, 5 to 4. Dr. Menarchik is going to do